I'm just going to find a place to sit and do it.
All right. Well, welcome, everybody. We're glad to have you here. My name is Ben Jealous. I'm the new executive director of the Sierra Club, first town hall. Well over 50 people signed up for tonight. Today, we're going to talk about the Willow Project decision, what it means, where do we go from here. We're joined today by Chris Hill, who leads our Wild America program, Ethan Manuel from our federal government team, and Dan Ritzman, who's been working on this as well. Right now, just want to be clear, we don't have enough time tonight to react to everyone's questions. We've got 1,000 people on the call, but we want to make sure that our members and supporters get the information they need on where we go from here and how to take action to protect our climate. We have a Google form for submitting questions available in the chat for this meeting. Just click on that and upload your questions, and we'll make sure that as many as possible get responded to. By now, many of you are familiar with, with the Willow Project, and I want to kick it to Chris Hale to talk about how we got here and the work that we've been doing. Chris?
Thanks, Ben. And my name is Chris Hill. I use she, her pronouns. I am based in Haines, Alaska, which is home to the Tlingit people on the Chilkoot and Chilkat rivers. And I am the senior director of the Our Wild America campaign. So big picture, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dan to talk a little bit more about specifics. But big picture, this project is a carbon bomb. It's one of the biggest oil and gas developments on public lands we have in the United States. It's estimated to emit nearly 300 million metric tons of carbon over its lifetime of 30 years. So that's equivalent to about 76 coal plants. That's huge. We all know it's going to disrupt wildlife and destroy habitats, and the people who live closest to it will bear the burden of the climate disasters that we see here. So this project is huge, and it's really bad, and it makes meeting our climate goals and the president's climate goals really hard. I want to dive a little bit deeper into what exactly this project is, where it's at, and really looking at what was the role of the federal government on this project. And I'm going to hand that over to Dan to talk a little bit more.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Everyone, my name is Dan Ritzman. I use he, him pronouns, and I direct the Lands, Water, and Wildlife campaign, which is part of the Our Wild America program. And I am normally based in Albuquerque, New Mexico on the Tiwa people's lands, but I am currently in our Washington, D.C. office. So just a little bit of stage setting. I'll try to do this quickly. If you think about the top of Alaska, the north slope of Alaska that sits up against the Arctic Ocean, that's about a 800, 900 mile coastline. The center chunk is owned by the state of Alaska and managed by the state of Alaska. And then the eastern and western parts of the Arctic are two of the biggest pieces of public lands that we have in this country. On the eastern side is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's about 20 million acres, size of the state of Maine. And we have been involved, and many of you have as well, in a 40-year fight to keep oil and gas development out of the coastal plain of Alaska. Over in the west is a 35 million acre piece of land, the biggest piece of contiguous public land in the country. And that's the Western Arctic, or the reserve as we call it. And that is where the Willow Project is located. So in the by the late 90s, the oil industry had pretty much filled up the entire state land process. There was oil development stretching from the Arctic Refuge all the way over against the reserve in the west. And the oil industry pushed to get access into that federal land on the western edge. In the late 90s, early 2000s, they developed this project called Alpine, which they pitched as the most environmentally benign oil field on the planet. Wasn't supposed to be connected with roads or pipelines. Then in the mid 2000s, they continued their march into the reserve, and they built another unit called Greater Moose's Tooth. And then in the 2010s and getting towards 2020, they continued that push with this proposal for the Willow Project. And the Willow Project was going to be hundreds of oil wells on 5 drilling pads spread across the tundra, connected by roads, pipelines, gravel pads, gravel mines. And we have been fighting this project from the very beginning. But ConocoPhillips, the major oil company that operates in the West, they have been pushing for it. During the Trump administration, they convinced the Trump's Department of Interior to approve the Willow Project, and Trump did that. We, the Sierra Club, along with a coalition of other groups, sued, and we were successful in court, and the court kicked out the Trump approval of Willow and gave it back. And by this time, we had the Biden administration in office. The courts gave it back to the Bidens, put them back to the drawing board, if you will. The court said that the Trump Department of Interior didn't look at the climate impacts enough of Willow. And so we have been working and pressuring the Biden administration to do that, to take a new look at this project, to understand, as Chris said, it is a ticking climate bomb, that they shouldn't approve this if they want to meet their climate goals. And where we are is they came out a little over a month ago with a proposed project, and then we've been in this fight for the last month, really ramping this pressure up on the Biden administration to disapprove of the Willow Project.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for that background. And that really takes us up to this week. So let's dive in. We all saw the news headlines, but let's talk about what they meant and what happened yesterday. Ethan?
Thanks, Ben. And again, my name is Ethan Manuel. I am here in Washington, D.C., where it's been mentioned I work on the federal policy team for the Sierra Club. And Washington, D.C. is the traditional lands of the Piscataway and Anacostia people here on the banks of the Potomac and the Anacostia River. And I've been working on this issue for a long time, working with Dan and Chris for years on protecting Alaska's North Slope from oil and gas drilling. And Dan did a great job teeing up where we were. As he said, the ball was in the court of the Biden administration to come up with a plan. And in response to that, the court's kicking it back to the Biden administration. ConocoPhillips had proposed to build 5 well pads as part of the Willow Project. And so the Biden administration and the Bureau of Land Management, which is the section of the Department of Interior that has jurisdiction over the Western Arctic, was considering a range of options. We were pushing for the no action alternative, where they would allow no well pads to be developed. Conoco was pushing for the 5, and we really ramped up the last couple of weeks with public, with comments, with rallies, with lobbying inside the White House and the Department of Interior, pushing them to reject ConocoPhillips' drilling plans. And it started to leak out that they were going to approve 3. And 3 is way too many. 3 too many. When you in context, 3 pads would translate to about 199 wells in the Willow Project. It would extract almost 200,000 barrels of oil a day with that many pads. So it would be a carbon bomb on our North Slope. And once that news came out, it is interesting. The Biden administration was surprised by how much criticism they were getting for proposing to allow 3 well pads to be developed in as part of the Willow Project. And many of you guys probably took part in this. This issue really took off on social media. There was a TikTok campaign. More than 600,000 activists saw that, reacted to the Stop Willow hashtag. And so it had become a really big issue. And they were surprised by how much criticism they got from the leaked news on Friday. So over the weekend, we did see the Biden administration try and put some conservation measures on the table. They were following up on an initiative of President Obama to permanently ban any new offshore drilling in the Arctic Ocean, which we're happy with. So that issue now is permanently off the table. No new leasing will happen anywhere in the Arctic Ocean. And then they proposed measures to prevent drilling from happening on 13 million acres in other parts of the Western Arctic, near the south and west of the Willow Project. We were happy to see those 13 million acres, but it's very ephemeral. There's not a permanent protection from drilling there. They weren't announcing a national wildlife refuge or any kind of protections for the wildlife that depend on the areas in the Western Arctic as breeding grounds and habitat. So we were happy to see those, but they're all ephemeral and they're not permanent. So those protections that they announced for the 13 million acres could be undone by future administrations. And then finally on Monday, we did see the official word that they were approving 3 well pads for Willow, which was really a climate disaster. The wrong decision by this administration. As Chris said at the very beginning, a project when you're considering 188,000 barrels of oil a day, that will make it hard for the Biden administration to meet their own very ambitious climate goals when it comes to our public lands and fighting greenhouse gas emissions. So the wrong move, but one that we're not giving up on. Just today, in fact, we filed a lawsuit to push back on that with some other conservation groups. But a very eventful week for Willow and a bad one for our climate.
Yeah, and Ethan, I would even say, like, when we look more holistically on the climate crisis and how we're addressing it with saving 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, this is in the opposite direction, right? Like you just talked about some of the good things that happened while not permanent protections or in refuges or wilderness areas. This decision, the Willow decision, is in the total opposite direction and will put us back even further to our climate goals. So yeah, I totally agree with all the things you said right there.
Yeah, it's hard to make any sense of it, frankly, right? I think we've talked about it the last couple of days, and it is completely out of context for what this administration has done on climate and on public lands policy, and is a real black mark against them.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, 3 out of 5. Like, we know that if they had gone to 2, this project wouldn't have been able to operate. Do you have any theory? I mean, I know we don't know for certain, but you've been up on the Hill for a long time for us, over at the White House for a long time for us. When you see something like this happen, help our members understand what you understand from your years of being on the Hill in Washington.
Well, it is interesting when you get to the numbers, right? That if they had done 2 pads, that still would have been too many, but it would have been better. It would have put the onus on ConocoPhillips to try and make that profitable. And so 2 would have been much better than 3. But I think you're just getting, and again, this doesn't make any sense either, but the Alaska congressional delegation had a lot of influence on this decision. And Alaska's economy is not very diversified. It's all based on oil and gas, as Chris probably knows from living in Haines, becoming an Alaskan. But Lisa Murkowski and Mary Peltola had quite a bit of influence over this decision, and that's what really kind of turned it. And again, that still doesn't make any sense. I mean, again, this administration has walked the walk when it comes to climate change, but did the wrong thing here on Willow. Obviously, Lisa Murkowski is a Republican from Alaska, isn't known for doing that. Hasn't really worked that closely with the Biden administration. So from the politics, it doesn't make any sense either, because though you're mollifying the Alaska congressional delegation, you're angering so many voters around the country who voted for the president because of his stance on climate, and especially younger voters who really organized we're organized like crazy in the last couple of weeks to push back on Willow. And that's where that social media campaign took off, because of young climate voters who really obviously care about this issue, care about their future.
Amen. So let's just kind of dive into what is Sierra Club going to do about it now. Dan, could you talk about what we're going to be doing going forward?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So, ConocoPhillips, as Ethan mentioned, they didn't waste any time in getting started. They got their approval yesterday, and they started building an ice road today towards the Willow development. They're going to build this ice road, and they're going to use it at the end of the ice road. They're going to start mining gravel out there in the tundra to start building these pads and to build other roads and access to this area. So they took action today, and we took action today. We filed litigation to try to stop this project. Again, we continue to say that the Biden administration didn't do enough to meet the NEPA requirements to move this project forward. And we're going to be looking again at the potential climate impacts from this project. And we're also going to be looking at other like wildlife impacts in that for this project as well. So that's the first thing we're going to do to get this, to address this, is to get at it through the litigation. And then to kind of follow up on what Chris said, our organizational goal is ultimately to protect 30% of our lands and waters. And so we're going to continue to dig in on opportunities for conservation in Alaska, whether that's permanently protecting the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, digging in on these potential protections in the Western Arctic and other places across the state. And then I think most importantly, we're going to continue to ensure that the Biden administration sees that our public lands are part of the climate solution and not contributing to climate crisis with these kind of oil developments. And the big way we're going to do that is to continue to push on the administration to look at oil and gas leasing through a climate screen or a climate lens. So we know that 25% of our greenhouse gases for this country come from fossil fuel development on our public lands. So we need to ramp that down to meet our climate goals. So the Biden administration, we anticipate them to come out with a rulemaking around oil and gas development, and we are going to use our political clout and our activists to make sure that they include this climate screen in that. And a climate screen would basically force them to look at what greenhouse gas productions would come out of these lease sales. And more importantly, a project like Willow, when they've already leased it, but looking at the permitting, you can apply that screen to the permitting as well. And if the greenhouse gases from those projects push us over the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, they then can't move forward with that. So that's where our energy is going to go from this project. We're going to take all this climate activism and we're going to push it out onto ending oil and gas leasing on our public lands ultimately.
Got it. All right. Well, thank you, Dan. And we got some more questions here. Folks are asking, are there still ways for me to work to stop the Willow Project? Are there other targets we can pressure? ConocoPhillips, banks, other decision makers? Folks still want to get in the way of this. I mean, this is, as Chris said, like 75 coal-fired power plants coming back online. Chris, Dan, Nathan, thoughts?
I'll jump in and then others can pile on. We definitely have that opportunity. We've been running this very successful corporate campaign around oil and gas development in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in the eastern part of the Alaskan Arctic. We were successful in getting the 6 major U.S. banks to say that they would not finance development in the refuge, and we have turned that attention to insurance companies as well to say they would not insure that level of development. We are going to continue to build on that campaign in a sort of Arctic-wide vision so that it doesn't just apply to development in the Arctic Refuge, but also applies to development in the Western Arctic. So that is another place to plug into this Willow effort to put that pressure on ConocoPhillips. And we will be exploring other options to more directly apply pressure on ConocoPhillips as well, to push them to see that it's bad for business to do this type of development.
Yeah, one thing I'd add to that is we need to just keep the pressure on the Biden administration to make sure this doesn't get replicated anywhere else, right? Dan referenced it in the lower 48 and off our coasts. It is real important for us to continue to advocate for this climate test also. The great thing about this climate test is even if a company owns a lease like ConocoPhillips does here in Willow, if you do apply the climate test, it can provide justification for denying those companies a permit to drill. Just because a company owns a lease, that's not a guarantee to drill. They still need to get permits from the federal government to operate on those leases. And so we're going to need citizens to weigh in on that climate test and all the other things that Dan mentioned to continue to push back on protecting the Arctic Refuge, which there's an additional lease sale left on the books from the 2017 Tax Act that the Biden administration is still going to have to make a decision on. And then we needed to, Sierra Club, we're uniquely positioned to keep doing the demand side stuff too. We needed to make sure that we get off of oil as quickly as possible by electrifying fleets, moving away from fossil fuels in the transportation sector, and making sure that ConocoPhillips can't make this profitable if we can.
And that's such a good point, Ethan. And we are gearing up here to really push out a whole team and train members to be ambassadors for the Inflation Reduction Act and to get out there and help their communities draw down those funds and decrease demand. And that's important. And yet, it's still, I know folks are worried that given what we saw in the Gulf with the IRA, given that we see this now, that there is a trend emerging of the Biden administration opening up more and more spaces for more and more oil and gas exploration, extraction, destruction, carbon bombs. So, Chris, being up there in Alaska, we spent, I think, half the year. What do you think folks need to understand about the dynamic in the lower 48? Is there anything you think we should be thinking about doing differently in the future? How do we prevent projects like this from getting approved again?
That's a great question. And, that's one that Dan really touched on in terms of like the bank side is one of the ways that we can really prevent more of these projects moving forward. But I also want to go back to what Ethan just said about sort of curtailing our fossil fuel usage. So in order for us to even address the climate crisis, we not only need to curtail our fossil fuel usage and move to clean energy, but also we need to save more nature. And that's where the 30 by 30 campaign comes in that Dan was talking about. And so as we look down the road, it's ending oil and gas leasing on public lands, right? It's saving more nature so that we have forests like the Tongass, which is right in my backyard, to be able to absorb that carbon and become carbon sinks. It's more of that moving across the country, all the way from the West Coast to vast wilderness, all the way to the East Coast and urban areas, as well as in Alaska. So, I think that folks feel sort of let down, and we will keep the pressure on the Biden administration, but we're not giving up. We're not giving up on Willow. We're not giving up on the fight against climate change. We're going to end oil and gas drilling on public lands. And, Willow may hurt right now, but it doesn't mean we're stopping the work. And the effort that happened on social media, I just want to highlight that again of what Ethan was saying. That was huge. That was really huge, especially for the fights that we're in right now in the climate crisis. There are so many young people out there who are very concerned about the climate crisis, and the way that they are expressing their concern is through social media. And it was a really beautiful movement that we saw in the last couple of weeks. So I really encourage and urge folks to continue that momentum that we saw on social. Talk to your friends, your community members, and so forth, and stay involved. For sure, stay involved with us in the work that we're doing, not only in Alaska, but all across the country. And really thank you for all the efforts that folks have been doing. We're not stopping. This is not the end.
No, that's right. And I think, the importance of people, frankly, not getting dispirited, staying focused, learning from this, fighting harder. This is a battle of organized people against organized money, and organized money won this time, but they don't win every time. And we've been doing a pretty good job of defeating them. I'm very excited about the litigation that we're going to be bringing. Dan, thank you for your role in that. Ethan, do you have anything else you want to share to folks about how they might get involved, the importance of staying involved?
Well, just that like you said, Ben, the persistence is the only thing that works on this stuff, right? We have to stay engaged the whole time. And we do beat them a lot. The oil industry, we take them down quite often. And so we need to stay in that fight. We've been able to block drilling proposals in the past, keep these areas off limits. And the Arctic is a good example, a good reference point, where in 2017, Congress did vote to open up that area. But because of the corporate work we've done, because of the grassroots work we've done, because of the work we've done on the Hill, no drilling plans were moving forward on Alaska, and there's in the Arctic Refuge, and there's very little industry interest because we have made that issue toxic. And we need to companies and to banks and to insurance companies, and so we need to keep that up. And so I think that's a good example of how, even though we took it on the chin policy, politically from Congress in 2017 and the Trump administration, we didn't give up. And as a result, the Arctic is still pristine. We haven't seen any drilling or development there, despite what the law says and despite the bad work that the Trump administration did. So that's a great lesson that we're going to apply to all these other places, that we're not going to stop pushing back, and we're going to use every lever we can to push back on this stuff.
That's right. And, let's speak to what happens when we keep fighting. Tonight, Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland reversed a Trump administration approval for a proposed land swap and road through the Izembek National Wildlife Refuge. It would have been costly, ineffective, and damaging to local ecosystems and wildlife. It was a threat to the very foundation of law that protects subsistence living and conservation in Alaska. This is a historic victory, and it's sweet for the folks on the call with me tonight. Working on this for years. Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Dan. It is a reminder that when we fight, we win. Unfortunately, Alaska's wildlife, lands, and waters face serious threats due to unnecessary development and climate change. And President Biden's decision to approve ConocoPhillips Willow Project and the additional extraction and disruption they bring only increases those threats. I think there's probably a lot of questions in folks' minds right now, like, how can I help the people and wildlife of Alaska right now? Chris, can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, great question. As we wrap up, it's staying involved. It's continuing everything that folks are doing right now, staying involved with the work that we're doing on the campaign side within Alaska. If you live in Alaska, definitely reach out to the Alaska chapter and get involved on chapter issues, local level issues. We're also working on a lot of the work that Dan, Ethan, and I work on, and keep talking about it. Keep talking about the climate crisis. Keep talking about our wildlife, our extinction crisis. Talk about it with folks. Get your friends and their friends' friends talking about it so that we can continue to forward that drumbeat that we have started with a lot of the work on the Willow Project and the social media that happened.
Ethan, Dan, are there other big oil and gas proposals going on right now folks should be aware of? Are there other fights that they should be joining?
Well, a little bit on this Arctic issue. The Arctic Refuge is next, right? We were still waiting to see what the Biden administration announces for that second lease sale, and we will need folks to weigh in to push back on that. We know we're going to see a comment period on that. We're going to have, we're still waiting to see what the Biden administration is going to do on offshore drilling. We expect the 5-year plan to come out at the end of this year, probably. That's been delayed by some issues in the courts and concerns about climate, but that's part of IRA, and we're going to need folks to weigh in on that. And same thing, we're probably expecting some other stuff to happen onshore. But Dan talked about it before. We are going to start going more public, pushing for the climate test to become part of the Biden administration's policy when it comes to public lands and oil and gas drilling. And we'll need folks to weigh in on that, because we need to keep organizing the same way we just did on Willow to take delivery on all those policies, because that's the only thing that works, is organizing, making a stink, being an engaged citizen is the way to move these guys to do the right thing when it comes to climate, public lands, and oil and gas.
Amen. And I know there's a lot of folks who are feeling hopeless right now. And let's not forget that we used to be trying to keep climate change under 4 degrees. Now we see a chance of keeping under 2 degrees. It's exactly because of all the fighting that we've been doing. It's because of all 1,000 people on this phone, not just the 3 advocates that we're highlighting. It's the millions of people in the Sierra Club and even more in our allies. We've got to fight. They have a lot of money. They won't stop. We can't stop either. And we cannot get discouraged. We are fighting for the future of humanity. Some people say we're fighting for the future of the planet. The planet will survive. The planet might even flourish. People would like all of our families to flourish too. You guys want to talk a bit about what this means for 2024? We're getting some of those questions too. And how do folks balance it in their own, the need to really fight, make sure Biden does the right thing, and also, frankly, make sure that he gets re-elected. How should people be thinking about that?
Well, I think we've talked about this a little bit last couple of days. Is that we have to make sure that the Biden administration does right on future decisions when it comes to oil and gas drilling. We need to hold them accountable between now and 2024. And whether it's all the issues I talked about, Arctic refuge, new national monuments, other protected areas, we need to make sure that they overperform on the environment, frankly, between now and 2024 to try and make up for this decision on Willow. But the good thing about the Biden administration is we have the ability and the power, and they're willing to do what we ask for them to do if we work well and work hard enough to do it, right? If we can get them to take delivery on these things, if we organize, if we lobby, if we do the campaign work on social media and traditional media, we can get them to where they need to go, but we need to work hard at it. But they are open to our ideas, right? They want to do the right thing on these things. We just got to create the political space for them to do it.
And Ethan, can we just stay there for a second? Talk to us about, like, are there regulations that we should be pushing to have strengthened?
Well, we do have a suite of stuff in the oil and gas sector. We do want to see more inspections, more increases in royalty rates and fees that the companies pay when they operate on public lands. We do want to increase the regulatory structure, but it really goes down to I'm a lobbyist. I'm going to stay on message. It's this climate test that we want them to adopt that will give them the opportunity to not permit leases that have been sold to oil and gas companies. And they need to remember that we're all trying to reduce our greenhouse gas. We want our public lands to be to not contribute at all, to not contribute any greenhouse gases emissions to the climate crisis, and we want them to be at zero. And so we can help the Biden administration do that if they adopt this climate test.
Amen. Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. Really, again, I want to celebrate Chris and Dan and Ethan and everybody who helped win the victory that is stopping that land swap, stopping that road. And I want to thank everybody on this call who is committed to continuing to fight. When we fight, we win. And the reality is that we win a lot. We have a lot to be proud of. We have shut down almost 300 coal-fired power plants. It's the most successful campaign to stop emissions in the history of our country. And our country is one of the world's largest polluters, so it's a big deal for the planet as well. One thing you can do tonight, you can go to sc.org/stopwillow, sc.org/stopwillow. Click on the link in the chat and tell President Biden we need bold climate solutions. No more oil projects on public lands. Thank you. Thank you for being a tireless advocate. Thank you for keeping the faith. Thank you for fighting where you are, and thank you for fighting together with every member of this Sierra Club to ensure that we save humanity and we save our wild places. God bless each of you.
Thanks, Ben.